The school bell rang, echoing through the hallways of Mount Ridge High School like a warning. Students rushed from their classrooms, eager for a brief respite before the next lesson. But Jake Carter wasn't in a hurry. He was too lost in thought, staring down at the cracked linoleum floor as he walked out of Mrs. Granger's classroom. A small crowd had gathered outside the door, some snickering behind their hands, others whispering in hushed tones. The whispers were about him, of course, Jake Carter, the farmer's son. It was an old story that never got old for the kids at Mount Ridge. The kid who didn't quite fit in. The one who didn't belong. Jake's heart raced, but he kept his head down, pretending he didn't notice the stairs. His boots clicked against the floor, a steady rhythm that didn't match the storm swirling inside him. What had just happened? He had been kicked out of class. Kicked out, in front of everyone, by Mrs. Granger herself. It didn't matter that the reason didn't make sense. That it wasn't his fault. All that mattered was that it was happening again. The same feeling of being an outsider. The same helplessness that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Jake, Tim's voice cut through the noise. Jake looked up to see his best friend pushing through the crowd, his lanky figure moving with the ease of someone who knew how to avoid conflict. Tim was always good at that. "You okay?" Tim asked, his voice low, a hint of concern in his eyes. He stood beside Jake, waiting for an answer. Jake didn't know how to explain. How could he? He wasn't okay. Mrs. Granger had been on his case all semester, giving him barely any chance to prove himself. Maybe it was the way he dressed. Maybe it was the smell of the farm that seemed to stick to his clothes no matter how many times he changed. But whatever it was, Mrs. Granger never missed a chance to remind Jake that he was different. "Yeah, I'm fine," Jake muttered, brushing past his friend and walking toward the exit. Tim didn't follow immediately. Instead, he stood there, frowning at the door where Mrs. Granger had just stormed out moments before. "You know," he said after a moment, his voice almost too casual, "you're not the only one she does that to." Jake stopped, turning to look at Tim. His best friend was standing a few feet away, looking thoughtful. "I get it," Tim continued. "She's tough on all of us, but I don't know, man. It seems like she picks on you more than anyone." Jake let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "It's not just her, Tim. It's everyone. It's always been this way. I don't belong here. I never have." Tim stepped forward, a little closer this time. "Don't say that, Jake. You do belong. Maybe not in this stupid school, but you belong somewhere. Don't let her get to you." Jake paused, the weight of Tim's words hitting him harder than he expected. He wanted to believe it. He really did. But there was a gnawing emptiness in his chest that no amount of encouragement seemed to fill. He took a deep breath, glancing around the school's parking lot. His old truck was parked in the corner, the rusty red paint faded from years of hard use. He could already feel the pull of home, the farm, the animals, the simple, honest work. It was a world that made sense to him. A world where he wasn't constantly measuring up to someone else's standards. "I don't know, Tim," Jake muttered, kicking a stone across the parking lot. "Maybe I should just quit. Go back to the farm full-time. At least there, I don't feel like a failure." Tim didn't reply immediately. He simply stood there, watching Jake closely. It was clear that Tim didn't want Jake to quit. He didn't want to lose his friend, but at the same time, he understood how much the world at school hurt Jake. "Think about it, man," Tim said after a long pause. "But remember, you're not alone in this. I've got your back. Always." Jake nodded, grateful but unsure. The words felt like a bandage on a wound that hadn't begun to heal. He wasn't sure what the next step was, but he knew one thing for sure, he couldn't keep going on like this. As he got into his truck and drove off, the school seemed to shrink in his rearview mirror, disappearing behind a haze of frustration and confusion. The road ahead felt empty, but not in the same way. The farm was his place. He could escape here. But there was something deeper gnawing at him now. What if there was more to life than just plowing fields and feeding cows? What if there was more to him than being the farmer's son? As Jake made his way home, the weight of the day followed him like a storm cloud overhead. But in the back of his mind, a question began to form: what if he could change his life? The answer was still unclear, but deep down, Jake knew that the universe had a way of throwing opportunities his way, whether he was ready for them or not. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jake's truck rumbled down the gravel road, the familiar sound of its tires crunching beneath the wheels a small comfort. He was used to the simple rhythm of farm life: wake up early, feed the animals, do chores, and repeat. Everything had always felt so certain on the farm. There, he knew his place. But the moment he stepped back into school after the incident with Mrs. Granger, everything seemed off balance again. As Jake parked his truck next to the barn and cut the engine, he leaned back in his seat, staring out at the open fields. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden hue over the land. It should have felt peaceful, but there was an unsettled weight in the pit of his stomach. He didn't belong here. Not in this town, not at this school, and sometimes, not even in his own skin. His dad, John Carter, was already out in the fields, working as usual. Jake knew his father's daily routine like the back of his hand: early mornings, long hours, and the occasional grunt of frustration when the crops didn't yield as expected. But his father was always there for him, always steady. Jake often wished he could just slip into that certainty, that kind of calm that his dad had. Jake stepped out of the truck and walked over to the barn, where his father was fixing a broken fence. The sight of his dad hard at work gave Jake a strange sense of comfort. John never complained. He just worked, and worked hard. "Hey, Dad," Jake called out, trying to sound casual as he approached. John looked up, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "Hey, son. You get through the day all right?" Jake shrugged. Same old, same old. You know how school is." He dropped his backpack by the barn door and leaned against the post, crossing his arms over his chest. "Yeah, I know. Your mom said you had a rough day with Mrs. Granger," John said, wiping his hands on his pants before continuing his work on the fence. "Don't let it get to you, Jake. Teachers are just doing their job. They got their own way of thinking, but that doesn't mean they're right." Jake sighed. "It's not just her, Dad. It's everyone. I don't fit in there. They look at me like I'm some kind of outsider. Like I don't belong." John paused, looking at Jake with a thoughtful expression. "You don't have to fit into anyone else's box, son. You got your own way of doing things. You're not like those kids, and that's all right. You don't have to be. You're working hard, you're taking care of your family, and that's something not a lot of people can say. That's what matters." Jake stared out at the field, feeling the truth in his father's words. But that truth wasn't enough to fill the emptiness he felt. The world outside the farm didn't make sense to him, and school was the place where he felt the most misplaced. He wasn't just the farmer's son, he was the kid with dirty boots and calloused hands, the one who could never catch up to the polished, perfect image the other kids seemed to have. The contrast between his life and theirs couldn't have been clearer. And every time Mrs. Granger scolded him in front of the class, it reminded him of just how different he was. "I know you're right," Jake finally said, though it didn't feel like the whole truth. "But it's hard, Dad. Really hard." John looked at him then, his face softening. "Life's never gonna be easy, Jake. But you're stronger than you think. Don't let anyone make you feel less than what you are. You've got what it takes to do anything you set your mind to. Just remember, no matter where you are, you've got this family behind you." Jake nodded, though he still wasn't sure if he believed his father. He appreciated the words, but the sting of being an outsider wasn't something that could just be brushed off. Still, he was grateful for his dad's unwavering support. As the evening wore on, Jake helped his father finish the fence before heading inside for dinner. His mother, Sarah, had already set the table, the familiar smells of roasted chicken and mashed potatoes filling the house. The warmth of the kitchen, the hum of their old refrigerator, and the low murmur of his parents' conversation made Jake feel somewhat at ease. Here, in this small house with the flickering lights and creaky floors, he felt like he belonged. But as he sat down at the table, he couldn't shake the thoughts of Mrs. Granger, her harsh words still echoing in his mind. She had always been the kind of teacher who didn't care much for excuses. When she'd kicked him out of class earlier that day, there was no second chance. No understanding. Just cold judgment. "Jake," Sarah said, breaking him from his thoughts. "How was school today? You look a little pale. Everything okay?" Jake forced a smile, taking a bite of his food. "Yeah, just another day. You know, nothing special." His mother studied him for a moment before nodding, as though she could tell something was off but didn't press further. She had always been more intuitive than his father, always able to read him better than he cared to admit. But for tonight, at least, he didn't want to talk about it. After dinner, as the dishes were being cleared away, Jake sat on the porch, looking out at the land once more. His dad was inside, watching TV, and his mom was in the kitchen, cleaning up. It was just him and the quiet of the farm. The air was cool, a hint of the coming fall chill, and the stars were just starting to dot the sky. He had always loved this time of day, when everything seemed to slow down and settle. But tonight, the stillness only made him feel more restless. His mind kept racing back to the classroom, to Mrs. Granger's eyes as she glared at him in front of the class, her words biting and unyielding. What was he supposed to do now? If he stayed in school, he'd always be the odd one out. But if he left, what was left for him? Would he be stuck forever in the same small world, with nothing but farm work to keep him company? As Jake stared into the night sky, a thought began to form. Maybe he wasn't meant to stay in this small town forever. Maybe there was something else out there for him, something bigger. Something that could change everything. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt a spark of something other than doubt. Maybe it was hope. Or maybe it was just the idea that there was more to his life than what he had always known. The next morning, Jake woke up to the sound of the rooster crowing in the distance, its shrill call cutting through the stillness of the early morning. His body moved on autopilot, the routines of farm life taking over as he stretched and rubbed the sleep from his eyes. The sun had barely begun to rise, casting soft pinks and oranges across the sky, and there was a crispness in the air that promised the coming of fall. It was the same as any other day, but inside him, something was different. The events of the previous day still hung heavy in his mind. Mrs. Granger's words replayed over and over in his head. It wasn't just her harsh judgment. It was the feeling of being trapped, of knowing that no matter how hard he tried to fit in, he would always be the odd one out. Jake stood up from his bed, grabbed his worn flannel shirt from the back of the chair, and pulled it on. As he headed down the stairs, the smell of coffee and frying bacon hit him. He couldn't help but smile. Even on days when everything felt off, the smell of his mom's cooking grounded him in a way that few things could. "Morning, Jake," his mom greeted him from the stove, flipping a pancake onto a plate. "Sleep well?" "Yeah, all right," he replied, sitting down at the kitchen table. His mom didn't look up, but he could feel her eyes on him, studying him as he absently stirred his coffee. "You know, you could talk to me if something's bothering you," Sarah said softly, setting a stack of pancakes down in front of him. "I can tell you've got something on your mind." Jake hesitated. He loved his mom, but sometimes it felt like she could see right through him. Like she knew when something was wrong even when he tried to hide it. I don't know if I belong there anymore, Jake confessed, his voice quieter than he intended. He ran a hand through his hair and sighed. Every day feels like a battle, Mom. Mrs. Granger, the kids. I just can't keep pretending like it's fine. Sarah put the spatula down and turned to face him, her expression softening. I get it. I really do. It's not easy. But you've made it this far, Jake. Maybe this is just a tough patch. High school isn't forever, you know. Things will change once you get out of here. And no matter what, you've always got a place here. You know that, right? Jake nodded, but her words didn't quite reach him. It wasn't just high school he was worried about, it was the life he had ahead of him. The life he had always known. He wasn't sure anymore if he wanted it. And that scared him more than anything. As he picked at his breakfast, lost in his thoughts, his dad entered the kitchen. He looked like he'd already been up for hours, his clothes dusted with dirt from the field. You headin' out to the fields? Jake asked, trying to distract himself from the storm in his mind. Yeah, John said, wiping his hands on a rag. Got to fix that fence before it rains. It's not gonna fix itself. Jake stared at his plate for a moment before speaking again. Dad, do you ever think there's more to life than this? More than just working the farm day in and day out? John's hands froze mid-wipe. He looked up at Jake, his expression serious. It wasn't often that Jake opened up like this, so John knew something was weighing on him. What do you mean by that? He asked, his voice calm but curious. Jake swallowed hard, unsure how to phrase what he was feeling. I mean, sometimes I wonder if there's something bigger out there for me. Something beyond just this farm, this town. John placed the rag down on the counter and sat across from Jake. His eyes were full of thought, as if he were trying to piece together exactly what his son was asking. Jake, he said, his voice quieter now, almost like a secret. I won't lie to you. Life on the farm is hard. It's not always glamorous. It's the kind of life that gets in your bones, and you start to wonder if there's more. But what you've got here, this land, this family, it's real. There's meaning in it, even when it doesn't feel like it. But if you feel like you need to go out there and find something else, then you have to do it. But remember, the world isn't always as kind as it looks from the outside. You've got to be ready for what comes with it. Jake looked at his father, who was always so sure of himself, always so steady in his work and life. It was hard for Jake to imagine ever being that sure of anything. I don't know if I'm ready for that, Jake admitted, his voice thick with uncertainty. John gave a small, knowing smile. Son, there's no such thing as ready. You just have to decide what you want, and then go after it. No one's going to hand it to you. Jake sat in silence, chewing his food slowly. His father's words had planted a seed of doubt in his mind. Could he really leave everything behind? Could he really go after something bigger, something unknown? Thanks, Dad, Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. His father nodded, standing up and patting Jake's shoulder. I'll be out in the field. You know where to find me if you need me. Jake watched as his dad walked out of the kitchen, the door creaking shut behind him. He was alone with his thoughts now. Alone with the question that had been gnawing at him for days. What if there was more to life than just this? Later that day, after finishing his chores, Jake made his way into town to run an errand for his father. The walk to the general store wasn't far, but it gave him time to think. His boots crunched on the dirt path, the sound almost deafening in the quiet afternoon. He couldn't stop replaying the conversation with his dad, and the more he thought about it, the more he felt like he was standing at a crossroads. When he arrived at the store, he noticed a few of his classmates milling around outside. He wasn't in the mood to interact with them, but one figure caught his eye, Tim. Tim was standing by the store's entrance, chatting with a group of kids from the high school. Normally, Tim was good at blending in, but today, he seemed distracted, his eyes darting nervously toward the crowd. Jake hesitated for a moment before walking over to his friend. "Hey, Tim," Jake called, his voice cutting through the murmurs of conversation. Tim turned, his face lighting up with recognition. "Jake. What's up, man?" "Not much," Jake said, forcing a smile. "You doing okay? You look a little off." Tim hesitated, then shrugged. "It's just some stuff going on with school. You know how it is. Mrs. Granger's been on my case, too. Seems like she's got it out for both of us." Jake's heart sank at the mention of Mrs. Granger. His mind started to race again, but he shook his head, pushing the thoughts aside. He needed something different. Something more. "Yeah, I know," Jake said, his voice quiet but firm. "But maybe it's time to think about what's next. For both of us." Tim looked at him curiously, the weight of Jake's words hanging in the air between them. "What do you mean?" Tim asked. Jake smiled, though it was small, uncertain. "Maybe it's time we start figuring out what's beyond this place. What's beyond the farm, the school, this town. There's gotta be more out there." Tim's eyes narrowed slightly, processing what Jake was saying. It wasn't the first time Jake had mentioned wanting to leave, but this time, there was something different in his voice. Something that suggested Jake might actually take the leap. "Well," Tim said, his voice thoughtful, "maybe you're right. Maybe there is something more out there. But whatever you decide, man, I'm with you." Jake nodded, feeling a slight weight lift off his chest. For the first time, he wasn't facing this uncertain future alone. Jake didn't sleep much that night. He tossed and turned in his bed, the same restless thoughts swirling in his mind. The weight of his father's words, about life being harder on the outside but worth pursuing if it was what he truly wanted, kept him awake long after the rest of the house had gone quiet. His mom and dad were sound asleep, no doubt already dreaming of another long day of work, while Jake lay wide-eyed, staring at the ceiling, contemplating everything that was about to change. It wasn't just the pressure from Mrs. Granger or the way the kids at school treated him. It wasn't even the looming uncertainty of what would come next. It was the growing feeling inside him that there had to be something bigger, something more than the small town and the farm. He had spent his entire life in this world, and while it had been enough for a long time, now it felt suffocating. He wanted to do something that mattered. He wanted to feel like he wasn't just following the same path everyone else had walked before him. The next morning, Jake headed to school with a heavy heart, still unsure of what to do with the sense of change hanging over him. He walked into the familiar halls of Oak Ridge High, his boots tapping on the linoleum floor, the sound echoing louder in his mind than it had ever before. The school wasn't anything special, a small building surrounded by fields and trees, with classrooms filled with students who barely noticed each other. But to Jake, it had always been home. Now, it felt like a cage. As he entered his first class, English literature, he immediately noticed that Mrs. Granger wasn't at the front of the room. The substitute teacher, a young woman with long brown hair and glasses perched on the tip of her nose, stood at the board, scribbling notes. "All right, class," she said, her voice sweet but firm. "Mrs. Granger is out today, so you'll be following my instructions. Let's start with a quick discussion on the novel we've been reading." Jake let out a soft sigh of relief. Maybe this day wouldn't be as bad as the last. The usual tension from Mrs. Granger's harsh glares and scathing remarks wasn't hanging over him today, and that alone made the school feel a little more bearable. He sat down at his desk, trying to focus on the lesson, but his mind kept drifting back to the conversation he had with his father. There had to be more. The thought refused to leave him. As class went on, Jake's mind wandered more than it should have, until the bell rang, signaling the end of the period. He grabbed his things quickly and stood up, heading out into the hallway when something unexpected caught his eye, a brightly colored flyer pinned to the bulletin board outside the classroom. "Farming Scholarship Opportunity," it read in bold letters. Jake stepped closer, intrigued by the idea. His father had always said farming was a noble career, but Jake had never seriously considered it as his future. Still, the words scholarship and opportunity made him pause. The flyer outlined a program for young people who wanted to pursue agriculture at a collegiate level. It mentioned grants, internships, and connections to high-level farming operations in other parts of the country. There was even a mention of an exclusive invitation to apply for students who showed promise and passion for agricultural innovation. Jake felt a strange tug in his chest. It was an opportunity, no doubt, but was it the kind of future he wanted? Was this what his father had meant when he talked about what was beyond the farm? Or was it just another dead end that would trap him in the life he was trying to escape? Are you thinking of applying? Tim's voice broke through his thoughts. Jake turned around to find his friend standing beside him, looking over the flyer. Jake shrugged, uncertain. I don't know, man. It seems like the same old thing. Just a different version of what we're already doing. Tim nodded thoughtfully, folding his arms. Yeah, I get it. But if you ask me, it's better than being stuck in the same place forever, right? The words hit Jake harder than he expected. Tim was right. It wasn't just about staying in the small town. It was about moving forward, about finding something that felt right. Even if it meant taking a step into the unknown. Yeah, maybe you're right, Jake said, suddenly feeling the weight of the decision fall on him. He hadn't even realized he'd been holding his breath until now. Maybe it's worth a shot. With a new sense of determination, Jake tore off the bottom section of the flyer and slipped it into his pocket. He wasn't sure if applying for a farming scholarship was the answer, but it was something. It was a step. And right now, a step forward was all he needed. By lunchtime, Jake's head was buzzing with possibilities. He sat in the cafeteria, picking at his food but not really eating. He was too lost in his thoughts to pay much attention to the chatter around him. It wasn't until he saw Mrs. Granger striding across the cafeteria that he snapped out of his reverie. She was walking toward the teacher's table, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor, her eyes scanning the room with her usual air of superiority. And then, for the first time, her gaze met Jake's. Mr. Carter, she said, her tone colder than usual. I trust you'll be keeping your behavior in check today. We don't want any more disruptions, do we? Jake didn't respond immediately. He just stared back at her, the words from their earlier encounter still fresh in his mind. He could feel the anger bubbling up inside him, the frustration at being treated like an outsider, like he was somehow less because of where he came from. But instead of snapping back, Jake stood up abruptly. No, Mrs. Granger, I think you're right, he said, his voice calm but firm. I don't want to be a disruption. With that, he turned and walked out of the cafeteria, leaving her standing there, speechless. Jake headed straight for the back exit of the school, the cool air hitting him like a wave as he stepped outside. He walked quickly, needing the solitude, needing the time to think. He wasn't sure if he'd made the right choice, but something inside him told him he needed to leave. He needed to figure out what came next. As he walked through the empty schoolyard, something caught his eye, a sleek black helicopter, its rotors slicing through the air with a sharp whir. It was coming in for a landing, right in the middle of the soccer field. Jake stopped in his tracks, blinking in disbelief. Who would be arriving in a helicopter at Oak Ridge High? It was the kind of thing you only saw in movies, not small-town schools. The helicopter touched down with a soft thud, and the doors opened. A figure stepped out, tall and confident, wearing a tailored suit and sunglasses. The man paused for a moment, surveying the school with a look of approval before heading toward the main building. Jake's heart raced. What was going on? Who was this person, and why were they landing in the middle of the school day? The helicopter sat on the school's soccer field like an alien spacecraft, its sleek black body gleaming under the afternoon sun. The loud hum of the rotors began to fade, replaced by the soft thud as the helicopter's wheels made contact with the ground. Jake's heart thudded in his chest as he stood there, staring at the machine in disbelief. It wasn't every day that a helicopter landed at Oak Ridge High, let alone in the middle of the school day. He could see the figure step out of the helicopter, a tall man in a tailored suit and dark sunglasses, looking every bit the part of someone who didn't belong in a small town like Oak Ridge. The man surveyed the school for a moment, his eyes scanning the area like he was sizing up a new environment. His movements were deliberate, confident, and Jake couldn't help but feel a strange sense of curiosity, and maybe even a little unease, welling up inside him. What in the world, Jake muttered to himself, his mind racing. He was about to turn and head back to the building when a voice called out to him. "Hey, Jake. You see that?" It was Tim, running up behind him. He was out of breath, clearly having sprinted from the cafeteria to catch up. "Yeah, I see it," Jake replied, still unable to look away from the figure. "Who is that guy?" "No idea," Tim said, staring at the helicopter with wide eyes. "But this is seriously nuts. This is Oak Ridge, man. You don't just have someone land in a helicopter here. What do you think he's doing?" Jake shrugged, his mind whirling with possibilities. "I don't know, but something tells me we're about to find out." The man in the suit began walking toward the school, his steps purposeful and steady. He had a calm, almost calculating air about him, as if everything around him was just part of the plan. Jake and Tim watched, their curiosity growing with each passing moment. "Should we go over and see what's going on?" Tim asked, nudging Jake in the ribs. Jake hesitated. His gut told him it might be better to stay away, to keep his distance from whatever was happening. But at the same time, there was a magnetic pull to the situation. Something about the man's arrival felt like the beginning of something big, something that could change everything. "Let's go," Jake said, his voice firm. "I'm curious now." They made their way over to the school's entrance, walking casually at first, but quickening their pace as they saw the man getting closer to the building. They reached the front doors just as the figure stepped inside, the sound of his polished shoes clicking against the floor like a drumbeat. The man was already talking to Principal Mitchell, who looked thoroughly bewildered. Jake overheard snippets of their conversation as they approached. "You're sure this is the right place?" the man was asking, his tone smooth but insistent. "Why yes, absolutely," Principal Mitchell stammered. I wasn't expecting this. But yes, this is Oak Ridge High. You're here for the scholarship, right?" The man's lips curled into a small smile, and Jake could see the glint of amusement in his eyes. "Exactly. That's why I'm here. I've got some business with one of your students. Mr. Jake Carter, I believe." Jake froze. His breath caught in his throat as all the blood in his body seemed to rush to his ears. He'd been expecting this visit to be about the scholarship flyer, but hearing his name brought an entirely new level of shock to the situation. "Me?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man turned his head and locked eyes with him, his gaze sharp and calculating. "Yes, you. I'm afraid you're about to get an offer you can't refuse." Jake's mind spun. The scholarship? But he hadn't even applied yet. How did this man know his name? Before he could ask any more questions, Principal Mitchell spoke up. "Mr. Carter, I didn't know you were in talks with anyone regarding, well, any kind of scholarship. But it looks like this gentleman is here on official business, and I think he might have more details to share." Jake's confusion deepened as he stood there, trying to process what was happening. He glanced at Tim, who was just as stunned as he was, but there was no time to react before the man stepped closer. "You've got potential, Jake," the man said, his voice carrying an undeniable authority. "That's why I'm here. We've been keeping an eye on you. I'm with a program that's looking for someone exactly like you. Someone with grit, determination, and a bit of a rebellious streak. Jake opened his mouth to protest, but the man held up a hand, cutting him off. I know you've been dealing with some things, struggles with your place here, perhaps. But what if I told you that the life you've been wanting isn't out of reach? What if I told you that you could be doing something far bigger than what you've known? Jake's mind reeled. The last few days had been filled with doubts and uncertainty, but hearing this man speak about something bigger, something beyond the farm and Oak Ridge, made his heart race. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the opportunity he had dreamed of. Bigger than this town? Jake asked, his voice thick with hope. The man's smile widened. Exactly. We're talking about global opportunities. The kind of work that changes industries. The kind of work that can put you in touch with people who shape the future. And we want you to be a part of it. Jake felt a lump form in his throat. Everything his father had said about the farm, about hard work and loyalty, seemed to clash with the idea of leaving it all behind for something unknown. But the man's words struck a chord deep inside him. Could this really be his chance to break free from the life he had always known? Are you ready to take that chance? The man asked, his voice quiet but intense. Because the offer is on the table. We have a spot for you, Jake. All you have to do is say yes. For a moment, Jake stood there in stunned silence. His mind was racing with thoughts, emotions, and a deep uncertainty about whether he was ready to leave everything behind. But deep down, he knew that this was the opportunity he had been waiting for. Jake took a deep breath and nodded slowly. Yes. I'm ready. The man smiled, his eyes gleaming with approval. Good. You won't regret this, Jake. Welcome to something much bigger than you ever imagined. The days after Jake's decision felt like they passed in a blur. He had made a choice, and though it still felt surreal, there was no turning back now. The man from the helicopter, whose name, it turned out, was Victor Carson, had left Oak Ridge High that day with a promise, that Jake would be contacted soon, that there would be more details, and that he'd be given everything he needed to begin this new chapter of his life. But for now, Jake was left hanging, uncertain about what came next. Back at the farm, things hadn't changed much. His parents still woke up early, worked late, and carried on with the unrelenting rhythm of farm life. They hadn't yet noticed the subtle shift in Jake. He wasn't as present, wasn't as interested in the mundane chores that filled their days. They assumed it was just the typical teenage restlessness, the yearning for something different that every teenager experienced. Jake's mind, though, was far from the farm now. He was constantly thinking about what Victor had said, about opportunities beyond Oak Ridge, about a future that wasn't just about tilling the soil and feeding the livestock. It was exciting, terrifying, and overwhelmingly confusing all at once. He hadn't told his parents yet. How could he? They wouldn't understand. They'd think it was another one of his flights of fancy, just another pipe dream he'd chase after for a while before abandoning it. The truth was, Jake didn't know if he could leave them behind. The farm was everything to his family, and though he wanted more for himself, it felt like betraying them somehow. His father had put everything into that land, and Jake had always been his pride. But was it really enough? Was it fair for Jake to continue living the same life, year after year, just because that's what his father had done? On the evening of the third day after the helicopter arrival, Jake was sitting on the porch, staring at the stars, when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, surprised to see an unknown number flashing on the screen. His pulse quickened. "Hello?" Jake said, his voice tight. "Jake Carter?" The voice on the other end was smooth, authoritative, the same voice he had heard that day in the school hallway. "This is Victor Carson," the man continued. "We've finalized everything on our end. You're in. The next step is for you to come to the city. We've arranged transportation for you tomorrow. There's a private flight waiting." Jake's heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, all he could do was stare at the phone in his hand. "A private flight? You're serious?" I'm always serious, Jake, Victor replied, his tone unyielding. You made the choice, and now it's time to follow through. We're offering you more than just a scholarship. This is a chance to reshape your future. Jake felt the weight of those words. A chance to reshape his future. The thought was so overwhelming that he almost wanted to say no, to back out and run back to the comfort of the farm. But he knew, deep down, he couldn't do that. This was his shot. Victor paused for a moment before continuing. You'll meet with some of the top professionals in the field, and we'll be setting up an orientation where you can see the full extent of what we're offering. You'll be in a program designed to get you involved in projects that will put you in contact with some of the biggest names in agriculture. It's an exclusive opportunity, Jake. Okay, Jake said, his voice barely more than a whisper. When do I leave? Tomorrow, Victor replied. The plane departs at 10 a.m. You'll need to be at the Oak Ridge County Airport by 9:30. Someone will meet you there. The line went quiet for a moment, and Jake could feel the weight of the decision press down on him. This was real. It was happening. Are you ready? Victor's voice broke the silence. Jake took a deep breath, steadying himself. Yeah. I'm ready. Good. We'll see you soon. With that, the call ended. Jake stared at the phone in his hand, still processing what had just happened. Tomorrow. Tomorrow, he would leave Oak Ridge. He would leave his family, his friends, the life he had known for 17 years. And though a part of him felt a pit in his stomach, another part of him, the part that had longed for something more, felt alive with anticipation. The next morning, Jake woke up early, unable to sleep any longer. The whole world seemed to have shifted overnight, and as he stood in front of the bathroom mirror, he barely recognized the person staring back at him. His face was tired, unsure, but there was something else in his eyes, a spark, a glimmer of excitement, maybe even hope. He dressed quickly, throwing on a t-shirt, jeans, and his boots, the kind of outfit that was just as much a part of his identity as the farm itself. His dad had taught him how to work with his hands, how to get his hands dirty and take pride in the labor that made the farm run. But today, it felt different. Today, he was preparing to leave all of that behind. Jake stood in the kitchen for a moment, watching his mom as she hummed while making breakfast. She hadn't noticed him yet, lost in her own world of morning routines. His dad was already out in the fields, and Jake knew it was better not to tell them just yet. He couldn't bring himself to say goodbye in a way that felt final. Jake. His mom turned, suddenly noticing him standing there. You okay, honey? You look like you're a million miles away. Jake forced a smile, not wanting her to see the chaos in his mind. Yeah, Mom, I'm fine. Just thinking. Well, thinking won't get you breakfast, she teased, setting down a plate in front of him. Come on, sit down. He sat down at the table, but his mind was elsewhere. He could barely focus on the food in front of him, the smell of pancakes and bacon barely registering as he replayed the conversation from the night before. The plane, the scholarship, the new world waiting for him. A plane. A chance at something bigger. But was he really ready for it? Could he leave everything he knew behind? Just then, his phone buzzed again, jolting him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Tim. Dude, are you sure about this? I know you're excited, but leaving Oak Ridge. Leaving everything behind. It's big. Are you really ready? Jake read the text, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. He thought for a moment, his heart heavy. But he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he placed the phone back down on the table. His decision had been made. No matter what, he was going. The next few hours passed in a blur. Before he knew it, Jake was standing at the edge of the Oak Ridge County Airport, staring at the small private jet waiting for him. His future was waiting, and there was no turning back now. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he walked toward the small jet, its sleek metallic body shining in the morning sun. The airport was unusually quiet for such a big day. There were no bustling crowds, no lines or chatter. Just the sound of the wind rustling the trees and the hum of the plane's engines as it prepared for takeoff. It all felt surreal. He glanced back one last time at Oak Ridge, the town that had been his home for so long. The field stretched endlessly behind him, the familiar outlines of the barns and silos standing like silent sentinels against the horizon. It was a view that had comforted him for years. But now, as the reality of his decision hit him, it felt distant, almost like a dream. Was he really leaving all of this behind? As he stepped onto the stairs leading into the jet, Jake's heart raced. His pulse was pounding in his ears as the flight attendant, a sharply dressed woman with a welcoming smile, stepped aside to let him on. "Mr. Carter, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Please, make yourself comfortable," she said, her tone polite but distant, like she'd done this 100 times before. "Thanks," Jake mumbled, stepping into the plush interior of the jet. It was nothing like the cramped back seat of the car he was used to, or the dusty pickup truck that had rattled him on countless trips to town. This was luxury, smooth leather seats, polished wood paneling, and a crisp, clean scent that almost made him feel like he didn't belong. As he sat down, the seatbelt clicked into place automatically, and the engines roared to life, the powerful hum vibrating through the floor beneath him. The jet began to roll down the runway, and Jake felt a tightness in his chest as the ground beneath them started to fall away. Oak Ridge, the farm, the life he had known for so long, he was leaving it all behind. The flight attendant offered him a drink, but Jake politely declined. He wasn't in the mood to make small talk, especially when his mind was consumed with questions he didn't have answers to. What was Victor Carson's game? Who were these people he was supposed to meet? What kind of life was waiting for him on the other side of this flight? And most importantly, was he ready for it? The plane ascended quickly, leaving the familiar landscape of Oak Ridge below. He gazed out the window, watching as the fields turned into patches of green, then small dots of houses, and finally, nothing but the clouds. An hour into the flight attendant returned to check on him. "We'll be landing in about 30 minutes, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice crisp and professional. "Please make sure you have everything you need." Jake nodded absently, staring out the window. It felt like the whole world was shrinking beneath him, the safety of Oak Ridge fading away with each passing second. He knew there was no turning back, but a small part of him, a part that was still clinging to the life he knew, wondered if he was making a mistake. 30 minutes later, the jet began its descent into a sprawling city. The landscape that had once been familiar, the open fields and farmland, was now replaced by rows of skyscrapers, highways, and the bustle of urban life. Jake had never seen anything like it. The city was huge, overwhelming, and far removed from the small, tight-knit community of Oak Ridge. As the plane touched down with a gentle thud, Jake's stomach did a flip. The jet taxied toward a private hangar, and before long, the door opened to reveal a small group of people waiting for him. There was Victor Carson, standing tall and confident, flanked by two others. One was a woman in a sharp suit, the other a man with dark hair and an easy smile. They all looked so polished, so composed. Everything about them screamed success and power, and Jake felt out of place, like a country boy who had wandered into the wrong world. "Welcome to the city, Jake," Victor greeted him, his tone warm but businesslike. "I trust your flight was comfortable." "Yeah, it was fine," Jake replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. His nerves were getting the best of him, but he pushed them aside. This was it. This was his chance. "Good," Victor said, motioning toward the other two figures. "This is Lisa Marshall, our operations manager, and Michael Davidson, our chief strategist. They'll be working closely with you over the next few weeks to get you acclimated to the program." Jake shook their hands quickly, trying to mask his nerves. Lisa gave him a firm handshake and a nod, her eyes sharp and calculating, while Michael flashed him a wide grin. He seemed friendly enough, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that everyone around him was sizing him up, trying to figure out exactly what he was made of. "Nice to meet you," Jake said, his voice tight. Victor turned to the group. "Let's get you settled in. We have a lot to cover." Jake followed them toward a sleek black car parked nearby. As he slid into the back seat, he couldn't help but notice how different everything felt. The car was more comfortable than anything he'd ever been in, and the smooth hum of the engine as they pulled away from the airport was almost disorienting. The city around him was a blur of lights and towering buildings, the pace of life speeding up with every passing second. "So, what now?" Jake asked, trying to break the silence. "Now, we take you to your new home," Victor replied with a smile. "You'll be staying in one of our private residences while you're here. It's close to the office, and you'll have everything you need to focus on your work." Jake nodded, but his mind was racing. A home? Office? Work? He wasn't sure what he had expected, but it certainly wasn't this. This wasn't just about the scholarship anymore, it was about something far bigger, something he hadn't fully grasped yet. They drove for what seemed like forever, the streets growing busier as they entered the heart of the city. Finally, they pulled into a high-rise apartment building, the kind of place Jake had only seen in movies. It was enormous, modern, and elegant. The kind of place that someone like him, the farm kid from Oak Ridge, could never have imagined in his wildest dreams. Victor led the way, and Jake followed him inside. The elevator ride was quick, and soon they were standing at the door to a luxurious penthouse apartment, the kind of place people would dream of living in. "Here it is," Victor said, unlocking the door and stepping aside. "Your new home for the next few months. We've already set up everything you'll need. Take some time to settle in, and then we'll discuss the next steps." Jake stood in the doorway for a moment, staring at the sleek, modern furnishings. The place was breathtaking, but it felt cold, impersonal. This wasn't home. This wasn't Oak Ridge. But as much as he wanted to run back to the farm, a part of him, the part that had been longing for something more, couldn't help but feel a rush of excitement. This was it. This was the beginning of something new. Jake stood in the middle of the penthouse apartment, staring at the view of the city below. The skyline stretched out before him, a sea of lights and glass, every building a monument to ambition. It was the kind of place people dreamed of, a far cry from the farmhouse where he had grown up. The room around him was minimalist and modern, the kind of place you'd see on a designer magazine cover. There were no signs of life here. No family pictures, no signs of familiarity. It felt cold, detached, like it belonged to someone else. Victor Carson had left him with a promise of more details later. For now, Jake was on his own. The front door clicked shut behind him, and for a brief moment, Jake stood alone in the stillness of his new world. The weight of his decision crashed down on him, the reality sinking in. Was this really his life now? How long would it take to get used to this? He had no answers. As the elevator doors slid open, Jake was pulled from his thoughts by the sound of someone entering the apartment. A tall woman with striking red hair and a confident demeanor stepped in. She was wearing a business suit, her heels clicking against the floor as she made her way toward him. "Jake Carter, I presume," she said with a warm, but professional smile. "I'm Lisa Marshall. We spoke on the phone." "Oh, yeah," Jake said, forcing himself to meet her eyes. His first impression was that Lisa was someone who didn't waste time. She was composed, serious, and knew exactly what she was doing. "Nice to meet you." "I'll get straight to it," she said, her tone businesslike but friendly. "I know this is all a lot to take in, but it's crucial that we start laying the groundwork for the program you're about to enter. We don't have much time to waste, so if you're ready, we'll dive right in." Jake nodded, still unsure of what exactly diving in meant. He had barely unpacked his bags. "Okay, sure." Lisa gestured toward the sleek dining table where a stack of papers sat, ready for him to go over. You're going to need to sign these forms. They're all standard non-disclosure agreements, confidentiality stuff, mostly, regarding the program you're joining. Jake blinked. Non-disclosure? What kind of program am I joining? Lisa smiled again, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. A program that's about a lot more than what you're probably expecting. You'll be working with some of the top minds in the field. You'll have access to opportunities that only a handful of people in the world could dream of. Jake swallowed hard. There was a part of him that was dying to ask for more specifics. What exactly was this program? Who were these people he would be working with? But he wasn't sure if he could trust Lisa's vague reassurances. She continued without waiting for him to ask. It's going to be intense. There will be challenges, but we believe in the potential we saw in you. It's why you're here. You're not just a farm kid anymore, Jake. You're part of something much bigger. Jake didn't respond immediately. He stared down at the papers in front of him, the weight of her words lingering in the air. Not just a farm kid anymore. That was exactly what he had been trying to escape from, but now that he was here, part of him wasn't so sure about leaving everything behind. Could he really be someone different? Could he become more than just the boy who grew up on a farm? Don't worry, Lisa said, noticing his hesitation. I know it's a lot, but the decision is yours. You don't have to sign if you're not ready. But remember, the clock is ticking. The program is competitive, and once you're in, there's no going back. Jake glanced at the forms again. There were a lot of legal terms and conditions that he didn't quite understand. But what struck him most was the last sentence at the bottom: failure to comply with the program's guidelines could result in immediate expulsion and forfeiture of all benefits. It hit him hard. This wasn't just a scholarship, this was something bigger. There would be no safety net if things didn't work out. He would be expected to perform, to prove he belonged. There was no room for failure. His heart raced as he thought about the farm, his family, the life he knew. Was this really the right path for him? Lisa seemed to sense his uncertainty. You're not alone in this, Jake. We have a team that will be there every step of the way. And if at any point you feel like it's not working, you can walk away. But you're here now. This is your chance to make something of yourself. And if you decide to stay, we'll make sure you have everything you need. Jake wasn't sure what to say. The idea of walking away felt impossible, but the fear of failure loomed over him. He had always been a hard worker, but he was used to a different kind of life. This was different. This was unfamiliar. Take your time, Lisa said, as if sensing his internal struggle. There's no rush. But remember, the decision you make today will shape your future. Make it count. Jake sat back in the chair, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows, his mind racing. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the city. The buildings glittered as if they were filled with endless possibilities. But it was also overwhelming, like a storm ready to engulf him. The sound of a buzzing notification on his phone interrupted his thoughts. He pulled it out and saw a message from Tim. So, how's the big city life treating you? You're really gonna go through with this? Jake stared at the text, unsure of how to respond. He wanted to say something reassuring, something that made him feel more certain about his decision. But the truth was, he didn't know. Everything felt so foreign. Lisa noticed him looking at his phone. That's a friend, I assume, she asked with a small smile. Yeah, Jake replied, tucking the phone back into his pocket. Just, a friend from home. She studied him for a moment, then said, it's normal to feel torn, especially at the beginning. But remember, you're not just here for yourself. You're here for something bigger. Something that could change everything for you, and everyone you care about. Her words echoed in his mind. Something bigger. But at what cost? Was he really ready to leave everything behind for a chance at something more? Let's go over the details of the program, Lisa said, pulling his attention back to the papers on the table. "Once you've signed, we'll get you oriented and start the real work." Jake took a deep breath, glancing once more at the city skyline before turning his focus back to the forms in front of him. The decision was inevitable. He was already here. He had come this far. And so, with a quiet but resolute exhale, he signed the papers. The next few days were a blur of meetings, briefings, and orientation. Jake barely had a chance to catch his breath before he was thrown into a whirlwind of instructions, tasks, and expectations. Lisa was his primary contact, guiding him through the maze of what seemed like endless paperwork and unfamiliar terminology. Michael Davidson, the strategist who had met him upon his arrival, would check in from time to time, offering small bits of advice or insight, but his presence was mostly distant, as though he was watching Jake from afar, waiting to see if he could handle the pressure. Jake's new life was a whirlwind, a far cry from the calm rhythms of farm life that he was used to. Every morning, a sleek black car would pick him up from his penthouse apartment and drive him to a high-rise office building in the heart of the city. The office was pristine, almost sterile, filled with people who moved about their business with a kind of quiet urgency that Jake found both intimidating and fascinating. Victor Carson was always somewhere in the background, a looming figure whose influence seemed to stretch across every corner of the operation. He was always too busy to sit down and explain exactly what Jake was doing here. Victor had promised that everything would become clear in time, but for now, Jake was left to navigate the storm on his own. The first week in the program was a haze of technical jargon and corporate strategies, far beyond anything Jake had ever learned on the farm. But there were moments when something inside him clicked. He was sharp, quicker than he thought he'd be at understanding the intricacies of the business world. He'd never been one for book learning, but out here in the field, this new, fast-paced world, he realized he could adapt. Despite the chaos, there was one thing that Jake couldn't shake, the nagging feeling that he was being watched. It wasn't paranoia, but something about the way everyone seemed to be waiting for him to crack. Lisa's calm, professional demeanor did little to ease his unease. She was always by the book, ensuring he kept up with the pace, but her eyes were constantly searching his, as though testing him to see just how much he could take. It was during a late-night session in the office when it finally happened. Jake was hunched over a laptop, staring at a spreadsheet filled with numbers and graphs that made little sense to him. He had been at it for hours, trying to absorb everything they had thrown at him. His eyes burned, and his brain felt like it was running on fumes. Lisa walked into the room, looking as pristine as ever, her heels clicking on the polished floor. "You're still at it?" she asked, a note of concern, though not much, touching her voice. Jake rubbed his eyes. "Yeah. Just trying to figure this out." She glanced at the screen, her gaze flicking over the numbers as if she could absorb them all in a single look. "You've been working non-stop. You're not going to make it through the night." "I have to," Jake muttered. All this stuff, it's overwhelming. I have to prove I can keep up." She sighed, pulling up a chair and sitting across from him. "You're doing fine. But here's the thing you need to understand, this program is designed to push you. To make you question everything. Your limits. Your potential. The only question is whether you'll let it break you, or whether you'll break through it." Jake leaned back in his chair, staring at her. "You make it sound like a test. Like I'm supposed to fail." "You're not supposed to fail," Lisa replied with a slight smile, "but most people do. The difference is that the ones who don't, they're the ones who come out the other side stronger. And that's what we're betting on you for, Jake. That you'll make it. That you'll break through." Jake wasn't sure what to make of that. He had heard enough about the program's rigorous standards to know that failure wasn't an option, but he hadn't realized just how much pressure they were putting on him. It wasn't about teaching him skills or building his knowledge. It was about seeing how much he could endure. "And if I don't?" Jake asked, his voice low. Lisa leaned forward slightly. "If you don't, you walk away. That's the deal." No strings attached. But if you do, you're in for something that most people can't even imagine. Jake stared at her for a long moment, the weight of her words settling on his shoulders. Was it really worth it? Was he ready to give up everything he knew for a shot at this? I won't fail, he said finally, his voice determined. Lisa nodded. I hope not. You've got potential, Jake. But you have to be willing to sacrifice a lot to unlock it. That night, as Jake returned to his penthouse, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He had never been one to back down from a challenge, but the stakes here were higher than anything he had ever faced. He wasn't just trying to prove he could work hard, he was trying to prove he belonged. And the truth was, he wasn't sure he did. As he sat on the couch, staring out at the city lights, a text message came through on his phone. It was from his mother, a simple message, "We miss you, Jake. Don't forget where you come from." Jake swallowed hard. He missed them too. He missed the farm, the smell of fresh hay, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. He missed the simplicity of it all. But this was his chance. His chance to be someone more. To step into a world where he didn't just survive, but thrived. The next morning, as he dressed in the suit provided to him, Jake made a vow to himself. He would not let this opportunity slip through his fingers. No matter how hard it got, no matter how far away from the farm he felt, he would fight for this. He would make sure he belonged here. He wasn't going to let anyone, least of all Lisa or Victor, think he couldn't make it. The days after his conversation with Lisa felt like they were moving in fast forward, each one a blur of meetings, presentations, and high-stakes decisions. Jake's head was swimming with strategies, financial models, and market analyses. There was so much to learn, so much to prove. It was overwhelming at times, but Jake had never been one to back down from a challenge. The pressure was unrelenting. Every time he thought he could take a break, another task would land on his desk. It wasn't just about doing well, it was about excelling. There was no room for mediocrity in this world, no space for mistakes. Jake was beginning to realize that he wasn't just competing with the people around him, he was competing with himself. The constant drive to improve, to push harder, to be better, was wearing on him, but he wasn't going to let it break him. Not yet. One evening, after another exhausting day at the office, Jake returned to his penthouse, the weight of the day pressing down on his shoulders. He dropped his briefcase by the door and collapsed onto the couch, letting out a long breath. His eyes were heavy, but sleep didn't come easily. Instead, his mind raced with everything that had happened in the past few weeks. He was a long way from Oak Ridge. Long way from the fields and the simple life he once knew. There was a knock on the door. Jake sighed, already knowing who it was. Lisa had become a regular fixture in his life, constantly checking in, making sure he stayed on track. She was like a drill sergeant, pushing him harder each day, demanding more. It wasn't necessarily a bad thing. She saw potential in him, and she wasn't about to let him waste it. But sometimes, Jake felt like he was living in a pressure cooker, on the verge of exploding. He stood up, walked over to the door, and opened it. Lisa was standing there, looking as professional as ever. Her suit was immaculate, and her expression was businesslike, but there was something about her demeanor that made Jake pause. "Jake, we need to talk," she said, her voice serious. Jake raised an eyebrow, stepping aside to let her in. "What's going on?" She walked into the apartment, her eyes scanning the room as though she was evaluating every detail. She didn't sit down immediately, as she usually did. Instead, she stood near the window, staring out at the city below. Jake could tell something was different. There was a weight to her presence tonight. "I've been monitoring your progress," Lisa began, turning to face him. "And I think it's time for you to take the next step." Jake's heart skipped a beat. "The next step?" She nodded. "Yes. You've been doing well, but there's one final test you need to face before we can move forward with your integration into the program. Jake narrowed his eyes. A test? What kind of test? Lisa's lips curved into a small, almost imperceptible smile. Not the kind you're used to. This isn't about your ability to crunch numbers or come up with market strategies. It's a test of your character, of your determination. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. What does that mean? It means that you're going to face a situation where your instincts, your values, and your ability to make quick decisions will be put to the ultimate test. She paused, letting the words sink in. It's going to be difficult. And you're going to have to make some tough calls. But how you handle this test will determine whether you're ready for the next phase of the program. Jake didn't know what to think. He had already been through so much, and now Lisa was telling him there was more. He thought he had been proving himself every day, showing them he could handle the workload, the intensity, the pressure. But this sounded different. It sounded like something far more personal. I'm not sure I understand, Jake said slowly. Lisa sighed, her expression softening for a moment. Look, Jake, you're in this program because we see something in you. You have the potential to make a real impact. But you also need to understand that this world doesn't wait for you to catch up. It doesn't give second chances. So we need to know if you can handle the heat. If you can make the decisions that will shape the future, even when the consequences are high. Jake's mind was spinning. What kind of test was she talking about? Was it a hypothetical situation? Or was it something much more dangerous? He wasn't sure he was ready for whatever this was. You'll be briefed in the morning, Lisa continued. But know this is the moment where you prove whether you belong here. You'll have to make a decision that could change everything. And there won't be time to second-guess yourself. So think carefully about your next steps. Before Jake could say anything else, Lisa turned and walked toward the door. Get some rest, she said without looking back. Tomorrow, everything changes. As the door closed behind her, Jake stood frozen in place, his heart pounding in his chest. A test of character. What kind of test could possibly require him to make decisions that would shape the future? And why was she pushing him so hard? He collapsed back onto the couch, rubbing his temples. Everything was moving too fast. One moment, he was in Oak Ridge, living the life he knew. The next, he was caught up in a world where every decision seemed to carry immense weight. A world that didn't give you time to breathe. A world that demanded the best, and more, out of you. Jake didn't know if he was ready for what was coming. But deep down, he knew that he didn't have a choice. He had signed up for this. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. Tomorrow would be the day that would determine his future. Tomorrow, he would face the test of a lifetime. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The morning came too quickly for Jake. The weight of Lisa's words hung over him like a dark cloud, casting a shadow over every thought. He couldn't shake the feeling that the test she had hinted at the night before would change everything. The decision he would have to make would alter the course of his life, perhaps even his future. He sat at the small kitchen table in his penthouse, staring at a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The morning sun was rising over the city, its golden light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but Jake barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, on the test, on the pressure, on the sense of impending doom that seemed to linger in the air. The phone rang, snapping him out of his trance. It was Lisa. "Are you ready?" Her voice came through the phone, sharp and direct as always. Jake sighed. "I don't think anyone could be ready for something like this." "You will be," Lisa replied firmly. "You need to come to the office. We'll brief you there." Jake stood up, his legs feeling heavy as he walked toward the door. "I'll be there in 15 minutes, he said, hanging up before she could respond. He threw on his suit, the one he had grown accustomed to wearing in his new life, but it felt different today, more like armor than attire. With one last glance at the empty apartment, Jake stepped out, his thoughts racing. When he arrived at the office, the atmosphere was different. The sleek, modern building felt colder today, and the usual hum of activity in the lobby seemed muted. He was escorted straight to a conference room, where Lisa and Michael Davidson were already waiting. They didn't waste time with pleasantries. Michael, his face set in a steely expression, motioned for Jake to sit. "We don't have much time. We need to go over the specifics of the test." Jake sat down, his stomach twisting in knots. He tried to steady his breathing, but his heart wouldn't stop pounding. Lisa began. "The test we're talking about isn't something you can prepare for. It's a real-world decision, and we need to know how you'll handle it under pressure. Here's the scenario: there's a critical contract coming up for one of our most valuable partnerships. If you make the wrong call, it could cost us millions." Jake nodded, trying to focus on the words, but the situation still felt surreal. "So, what's the decision?" Michael leaned forward, his voice low. "There's a person involved in this deal, a key figure on the other side. We've learned something troubling about them. The issue is this: they're hiding something about their past, something that could hurt our reputation if it gets out." Lisa continued, her tone calculated. "Your job is simple. You can either expose this information, risking a massive fallout, or you can bury it, which would keep the deal intact but compromise our integrity. Either choice will have significant consequences." Jake's mind was reeling. The weight of the decision was suffocating. He could feel the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. Exposing the truth would likely cause a scandal, but it could also protect the company from future damage. On the other hand, keeping quiet would allow the partnership to continue, but at the cost of his moral compass. There was no right answer, only the choice between two wrongs. "You'll have 1 hour to make your decision," Michael said. "There are no second chances." Jake looked at Lisa, then Michael, his throat dry. "I don't know if I can do this," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Lisa's gaze softened for a moment, but only for a second. "You can. You've already proven you have what it takes to make tough calls. This is just another test. The difference is, this one involves more than just numbers. It involves values. Ethics. What kind of person do you want to be, Jake?" The silence in the room was deafening. Every word she said seemed to echo in Jake's mind. What kind of person did he want to be? This wasn't just about doing well in a corporate world he barely understood, it was about who he would become. For the next hour, Jake sat there, torn between the two choices. His heart was heavy with the weight of his options. He could already see the ripples of whatever choice he made, and neither seemed like a path he could walk without consequences. Finally, Jake stood up, the decision made, but the outcome unclear. "I'll expose the information," he said, his voice shaking but steady. "We can't compromise our integrity, no matter the cost." Michael's expression didn't change, but Lisa's eyes flashed with approval. "Good choice. A difficult one, but the right one. We'll support you through this, but understand, there will be consequences." In the following days, the fallout from Jake's decision was swift. The partnership was put on hold as the other party scrambled to control the damage from the exposed information. The company's leadership team was thrown into a frenzy, trying to mitigate the negative publicity and ensure that the damage to their reputation would be limited. Jake felt the weight of their eyes on him, the judgment, the disapproval. But he also felt something else, a sense of pride. He had made the right choice, even if it had cost him. But then, as the dust began to settle and the company stabilized, Jake realized something else: he wasn't the only one being tested. His decision had caused ripples not just within the company, but throughout his personal life as well. The pressure was far from over, and now, Jake had to come to terms with the fact that he had crossed a line. There was no turning back. He had chosen the hard path, the one that demanded his character, his integrity, and his willingness to take risks. Now he had to live with the consequences. Jake sat alone in his office, staring at the glowing screen of his laptop. The usual noise of the city outside his window felt muffled, as if it were happening in another world. Inside, his thoughts were a whirlwind, a constant loop of self-doubt and regret. Had he made the right decision? It was a question he couldn't seem to shake. The days since he exposed the information about the partnership had been a blur. The company's leadership had scrambled to handle the fallout, issuing statements and working overtime to manage the public relations nightmare. The board had held an emergency meeting, and Jake was called in, expected to justify his decision. He had stood his ground, explaining that integrity should always come before profit, no matter the cost. Some of them had nodded, but others had looked at him as if he were a fool. Jake wasn't sure what hurt more, the scorn he'd received from some of the higher-ups or the silence from his colleagues, who had once seemed so eager to include him. They weren't as friendly anymore. He had made a choice, and that choice had cost him more than just the partnership, it had cost him a place in the company's inner circle. No matter how much they told him it was the right decision, Jake could feel the chill in the air. The trust was gone. He was no longer one of them. But there was more to it than just that. The aftermath had affected his personal life too. Lisa, the ever-present guiding force in his journey, had become distant. She wasn't as quick with words of encouragement anymore. Her calls were brief, to the point, and she kept her distance when they met in person. Jake couldn't help but feel that she was disappointed in him, even though she had been the one who pushed him to make the tough calls in the first place. It was as if he had let her down by choosing integrity over business, and he wasn't sure how to fix it. It was late one evening when his phone rang. The name on the screen made Jake freeze. Lisa. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope that perhaps she was calling to offer support, to explain her silence. He answered quickly. Jake, Lisa's voice came through the phone, sounding colder than usual. We need to talk. He couldn't hide the tension in his voice. I know. I've been wondering when you were going to say that. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Jake could hear Lisa's breath. You made the decision you thought was right. But I need you to understand, this isn't just about ethics. This is about survival. In this world, integrity alone doesn't cut it. You need to be strategic. You need to think long-term. Jake's stomach tightened. So you're saying I made the wrong choice? Another pause, this one longer. I'm saying that you need to consider the bigger picture. You put the company at risk, and for what? A moral stand that few will remember, but the consequences will last for years. People will talk, Jake. And the next time a decision like this comes up, they'll wonder if you'll make the right call. You've proven that you're willing to make a tough call, but you've also shown that you're not willing to compromise. And in this game, that could be your downfall. Jake swallowed hard, her words sinking into his skin like a needle. So what now? What am I supposed to do? You need to be prepared for the fallout, Lisa said, her tone unyielding. Your decision has already changed things. The trust, the alliances, it's all shifted. People in this company aren't as forgiving as you might think. It's not over. You'll be tested again. And next time, there might not be an option to be the good guy. You'll have to choose. Choose what? Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. Choose your survival, Lisa replied. Choose what you want your future to look like. Because right now, you're on the edge of losing it all. The call ended with a click, leaving Jake in the heavy silence of his office. He stared at the phone in his hand, feeling the weight of her words like a heavy stone in his chest. Survival. That's what she had said. It wasn't about doing what was right or moral. It was about surviving this ruthless world of corporate warfare. The thought made him sick. But as much as he hated to admit it, Jake couldn't deny the reality of her words. He had made a bold decision, but that decision had come with a price. The company was in damage control mode, trying to salvage what they could from the wreckage. His colleagues had grown colder, and the whispers behind his back were getting louder. No one knew whether to trust him anymore. And when it came down to it, trust was the only currency that mattered in this world. He didn't have long to wallow in self-doubt, though. The phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Michael Davidson. He had an urgent meeting scheduled for the morning. Jake's gut tightened as he read the words. "Be there. We need to discuss the next steps. Your future depends on it." The following morning, Jake arrived at the office early, his stomach a knot of anxiety. He walked into the conference room to find Michael sitting at the head of the table, his expression as impassive as ever. Lisa was standing at the window, her back to him, her arms crossed. She didn't turn when he entered. "Sit down, Jake," Michael said, motioning to the seat across from him. Jake sat, his palms sweaty as he placed his hands on the table. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with unspoken words. "We've been discussing your position within the company," Michael began. "And after careful consideration, we've decided that we need to test your commitment to this company, your ability to make decisions in line with our long-term goals." Jake's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Lisa turned around, her eyes cold. "We're not sure where you stand anymore, Jake. After your last decision, we've seen a crack in your resolve. You made a choice that, while admirable, didn't align with our expectations. So now, we need to see if you have what it takes to stay here." Jake was stunned. "You're putting me to another test." "This is no longer just about ethics," Michael said sharply. "This is about who you are, and whether or not you're capable of playing the game. We'll give you one last chance to prove yourself. If you fail, you're out. But if you succeed, you'll earn your place in this company, and in this world." Jake sat back in his chair, his mind racing. It seemed the test had only just begun. Jake sat in his office, staring at the email that had just arrived. The subject line was simple, yet it felt like a death sentence: "Your final test." His mind was spinning, trying to process the words, trying to comprehend the weight of what was being asked of him. Michael had been clear, this was his last chance to prove himself, to show that he was willing to make the difficult decisions that would ensure his survival in the company. And the test? It wasn't a simple one. It wasn't a matter of ethics anymore, it was a matter of sacrifice. Jake had always known that working in the corporate world would mean making tough choices. But nothing had prepared him for the kind of choice that now lay before him. He could feel the walls of the office closing in on him, the weight of the decision pressing down like an iron fist. The email outlined the details of the final test. A major deal was about to go through, a deal that would solidify the company's place in the industry for years to come. But there was a catch. The deal involved an influential figure, someone with ties to a criminal network, and Jake was tasked with either protecting the deal or exposing the truth. The catch? Exposing the truth would lead to the collapse of the deal, potentially ruining the company's future and costing hundreds of jobs. Keeping the secret, however, would ensure the deal went through, but it would forever stain the company's reputation. The decision was binary: protect the company's future at the cost of integrity, or preserve integrity at the cost of the company's future. Jake's stomach churned. It was a decision that seemed impossible to make. His mind raced as he thought about everything he had worked for, the friendships he had formed, the respect he had earned, the power he had gained. But at what cost? How much of himself had he already sacrificed? He couldn't help but think about the conversation with Lisa. Her coldness had been like a slap to the face, but what hurt more was her warning: this isn't just about right and wrong, Jake. It's about your survival. As he sat in his office, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Lisa. "We need to meet. I've been thinking about your position. This could be your final chance to earn back your place." Jake sighed, his fingers trembling slightly as he typed a response. "Where?" The usual place. Lisa's reply was short and to the point. The usual place was a small cafe on the corner of a busy street, a place that Jake and Lisa had frequented during the early days of their partnership. It was quiet, tucked away from the hustle of the city, and it gave them the privacy to discuss the things that mattered most. Jake arrived a few minutes early, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of the decision hung over him like a dark cloud, and he couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what he chose, he was going to lose something valuable. As he sat down at the table, Lisa appeared, her face unreadable. She sat across from him, her gaze fixed on him. "You're thinking about it too much, Jake." Jake frowned. "How can I not think about it? This is the biggest decision of my life." Lisa leaned in slightly, her voice low. "I know it's hard. But you need to stop second-guessing yourself. You made a choice already. You've committed to this world. Now you need to choose if you're going to play the game or get out." Jake looked at her, searching for any hint of the woman he had once admired. "What do you mean, get out?" "You know what I mean," Lisa replied, her tone sharp. "You can't keep trying to hold on to both sides of this. You're in or you're out. There's no middle ground anymore." Jake felt a knot form in his stomach. "I thought you believed in me. I thought you were guiding me through this." "I'm not guiding you, Jake," Lisa said, her voice cold. "I'm showing you the way forward. But you're the one who has to walk it." The conversation between them felt like a wall was slowly growing between them, brick by brick. Jake had always trusted Lisa, had always looked up to her as a mentor and a guide. But now, in the cold light of reality, he was starting to see her for what she truly was, someone who believed in the game, in the system, in survival at any cost. And he wasn't sure if he could keep playing. Lisa's words lingered in his mind as he left the cafe and made his way back to his office. "You're in or you're out." But Jake wasn't sure if he was ready to be all in. Not anymore. That evening, Jake stood at the window of his office, looking out over the city. The lights below twinkled like stars, but they felt distant, almost unreachable. He had worked so hard to get here, to prove himself. But now, the weight of his choices threatened to crush him. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Michael. It was direct, with no pleasantries. "We need to talk. The deal's happening tomorrow. Be ready." Jake's heart sank. Tomorrow. The decision would be made, one way or another. He had to act fast, but the pressure was suffocating. The next day, Jake sat across from Michael and the board members, their faces unreadable as they laid out the details of the deal. He knew that this was his moment, his final test. He could either play the game and secure the future of the company, or he could expose the truth and risk everything. The decision was his, and his alone. Michael spoke first, his voice low and controlled. "Jake, this is it. This deal will determine everything. Do we go forward, or do we pull the plug?" Jake's hands gripped the edge of the table, his mind racing. His heart was beating so loud, he thought everyone in the room could hear it. He glanced around at the faces of the people he had once considered allies, and then he looked at Michael. The pressure was unbearable, but he knew what he had to do. "I won't compromise our values," Jake said, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "I can't be part of a deal that's built on lies. I'm pulling out." The room fell silent. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. Michael's face twisted in a mix of disbelief and frustration, but he didn't say a word. Jake stood up, his decision made. He could already feel the consequences of his choice, he knew what was coming next. But it didn't matter. He had done what he believed was right. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving the weight of the company's future behind him. Jake's decision had sent shockwaves through the company, reverberating far beyond the boardroom. Word had spread fast, Jake had walked away from the deal, a move that no one, not even his closest allies, had anticipated. For a man who had been on the fast track to corporate success, this was nothing short of a self-inflicted fall from grace. The silence in his office was oppressive. For the first time in years, Jake didn't feel the comforting hum of productivity in the air. No calls, no emails, no messages. His colleagues had all but vanished, and the empty space felt more like a reflection of his own mind, void, uncertain, and hollow. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tracing the surface of his desk, which suddenly seemed too small to contain the enormity of the decisions weighing on him. The walls of the office, once a symbol of his success, now felt suffocating. Jake had always known that walking away from the deal could cost him everything, but the reality of it was harder than he'd imagined. His future at the company was in jeopardy, but there was more at stake than just his career. He had put everything he had into this moment, his values, his reputation, his sense of self. Now, he was unsure whether he had done the right thing, or if he had simply doomed himself to irrelevance. That evening, Lisa called again. Jake had expected this. After all, Lisa had been the one to encourage him to make a bold stand. But the tone in her voice was different this time. There was no warmth, no mentorship, just business. "You've made your decision, Jake," Lisa said flatly. "And now you have to live with it." "I know," Jake replied, the weight of her words sinking in. "But I don't know if I can handle the fallout. There's no turning back now. You made a stand, but there's no safety net. The company is already making moves behind the scenes. They're looking for someone to blame." Jake sighed, rubbing his temples. "I didn't think it would be like this. I thought I could make a difference." "You did make a difference," Lisa said, her voice softening, but only slightly. "But there's a price for that kind of difference. And right now, you're paying it." He swallowed hard. "What now?" "You wait," Lisa said, her tone businesslike again. "Wait to see what happens next. There's nothing else you can do." Jake spent the next few days in a daze. The emails piled up, but he couldn't bring himself to respond to any of them. He walked the hallways of the office, but no one made eye contact. His colleagues had become ghosts, their whispers echoing off the sterile walls. The pressure of their judgment hung heavily in the air. Then, one day, a call came from an unexpected source. His phone rang, the name on the screen a blast from the past, Sarah. "Jake? It's Sarah." For a moment, Jake wasn't sure if he had heard her correctly. Sarah? They hadn't spoken in years, not since she had moved to another company and their relationship had quietly dissolved. "I know it's been a while," she continued, "but I saw what happened with the deal. I wanted to check in on you." Jake's heart sank. "You saw?" "Everyone saw, Jake," Sarah said. "It's all over the news. They're calling it the fall of a rising star." He laughed bitterly. "Great. That's exactly what I needed to hear." "Jake, I'm serious. I'm not calling to rub it in. I've been through something similar, and I want to help." Jake was silent for a moment. He didn't know why, but hearing her voice felt like a lifeline, even if he wasn't sure he wanted to be saved. "I don't know what to do anymore, Sarah. I thought I was doing the right thing. But now I'm just lost." "There's a way out of this, Jake," Sarah said, her voice steady. "You don't have to do this alone." "What do you mean?" Jake asked, intrigued despite himself. "You've been backed into a corner. But I know people. I can help you navigate this, find a way forward. It's going to be tough, but you don't have to do this without support." Jake's mind was spinning. Part of him wanted to refuse, to stay the course and face the consequences of his choices. But another part of him, the part that felt like he was drowning, longed for a lifeline. "What do you need from me?" Jake asked, his voice weary. "Let's meet," Sarah said. "Tomorrow, noon. There's a lot to talk about." Trust me. I have a plan. The next day, Jake met Sarah at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. It was a quiet place, far from the hustle of corporate life. As soon as Sarah arrived, Jake could tell that she had changed. The sharp businesswoman he had known was gone, replaced by someone more cautious, more guarded. She had clearly learned some hard lessons over the years. "Jake, I don't have time for niceties," Sarah said as she sat down across from him. "The clock's ticking. You need to decide whether you're going to sink or swim." "I don't want to sink," Jake replied, the words coming out more desperate than he intended. "Good," Sarah said, her tone firm. "Here's the thing, you've made your choice, but now you need to capitalize on it. You've built a reputation, Jake, and people will follow you if you play this right. But you can't sit around and wait for things to fall into place. You need to move now." Jake nodded, still unsure of how to proceed. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "First, you need to stop acting like you're alone in this. There are people who are willing to back you, but they need to know you're not just going to crumble. Second, you need to regain control. You walked away from that deal, and that's commendable. But now, you need to show that you can still lead. You can still make an impact. The question is, how?" Jake leaned forward, his eyes locked on Sarah's. "And what's the catch?" "The catch?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Jake, there's always a catch. But if you're serious about this, we'll figure it out. I've seen your potential. I know what you're capable of." For the first time in days, Jake felt a spark of hope. He wasn't sure where this would lead, but he knew one thing: he wasn't done yet. Jake spent the next few days in a haze of confusion and disbelief. Everything he thought he knew about the corporate world had been turned on its head. But there was something in Sarah's words that had stayed with him, the idea that he could still make an impact. He wasn't done yet. He didn't have to let his career be defined by the fall. There was still time to rise again. The meeting with Sarah had been a turning point, but Jake knew that in order to take control of his future, he would need more than just hope, he needed a plan. Sarah had offered him a lifeline, but it was a risky one. It wasn't going to be easy, and there were no guarantees. But Jake had never been one to back down from a challenge. It was late in the evening when Jake finally picked up the phone and called her. He had spent hours staring at the walls of his office, his mind churning with the possibilities. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. If he was going to pull himself out of this mess, it needed to happen now. "Sarah," Jake said as soon as she picked up. "I'm in. Let's talk about the plan." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and then Sarah's voice came through, steady and calm. "Good. I knew you'd come around. Meet me tomorrow at noon, same place. It's time to put everything in motion." The next day, Jake sat in the same cafe with Sarah, the same quiet, secluded place where they had first spoken about the deal and its fallout. But this time, the air between them felt different. There was a sense of purpose now. Sarah had a plan, and Jake was ready to follow it, no matter where it would lead. Sarah didn't waste any time getting to the point. "You've got two options, Jake. You can either let the company keep moving forward without you, or you can step up and lead this in a way that no one expects. But if you choose the second option, you're going to have to be bold. You're going to have to do something completely unexpected. Something that no one, not even your enemies, will see coming." Jake nodded, his mind already racing with the possibilities. "What do I need to do?" "First, you need to rebuild your reputation. Right now, you're seen as someone who lost everything in a moment of weakness. You need to change that. You need to remind people why they believed in you in the first place." "I don't even know if I can do that. The damage is done." "No," Sarah said firmly. "It's not done. Not yet. You need to start with the people who've turned their backs on you. You have to find a way to get them on your side. But you can't do it by playing it safe. You need to make a statement. Jake leaned in, intrigued. What kind of statement? You need to go public with a new project, a big one. Something that will show the world that you're still relevant. You've got the knowledge, the connections, and the experience. It's just about finding the right thing to attach your name to. Something that will make people stop and listen. Jake ran a hand through his hair. It sounded like a long shot. A huge gamble. But he had no choice. He wasn't going to wait for the company to hand him a second chance. He was going to make one. Okay, Jake said. And what's the second part of the plan? Sarah smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. You need to use the people around you to your advantage. There's a group of insiders within the company who have been quietly supporting you. They've been waiting for the right moment to back you up, but they're waiting for a signal. You need to make it clear to them that you're still in this game. Jake's stomach tightened. He had always trusted his instincts, but this was different. He had never worked so closely with the people he once considered rivals. It was a delicate balance, one misstep, and everything could fall apart. How do I reach them? Jake asked. It's not about reaching them directly. It's about creating an opportunity for them to act. You're going to leak information about a new project, something big, something that only you could pull off. It's going to get their attention, and when they come to you, you'll have the power. It's a game of timing, Jake. You'll need to know when to strike. Jake exhaled slowly. He didn't like the idea of playing games, but Sarah's words made sense. This was his shot. If he waited too long, he might lose everything. But if he played it right, he could still turn things around. What's the project? Jake asked, his voice low. Sarah paused before answering, her eyes narrowing as she spoke. It's a tech startup. You know the one that's been making waves in the industry. They've been working on something groundbreaking, and they need a partner with the kind of experience and connections you have. It's a huge opportunity, but it's also risky. If you can pull it off, you'll prove to everyone that you're still a force to be reckoned with. Jake's mind was spinning. A tech startup? It was the kind of project that could change everything. But it was also the kind of gamble that could make or break him. There was no middle ground. He either succeeded or he disappeared into obscurity. He looked at Sarah, his eyes steely with determination. Okay, I'll do it. Sarah smiled, her expression approving. Good. But remember, Jake, this isn't just about saving face. It's about creating something new. It's about showing everyone that you're not just a product of the system, that you can rise above it. Jake stood up, his decision made. He was going to do this. No matter what it took. Over the next few weeks, Jake worked tirelessly, pulling together the resources he would need to launch the project. It was a delicate dance, balancing the needs of the company with the demands of the startup. He had to navigate through the murky waters of corporate politics, all while building his own team of supporters. The pressure was mounting, but Jake felt something that he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. The plan was risky, but it was the only option he had left. He couldn't afford to fail. As the project began to take shape, Jake knew that he was on the edge of something big. But the question was, would it be enough to pull him out of the abyss? Or was he walking into an even bigger trap? Jake sat in his apartment late at night, the glow of his laptop casting long shadows on the walls. The weight of the past few weeks felt like a stone lodged deep in his chest, but he couldn't stop now. The tech startup was moving forward, and every decision he made would determine whether he would claw his way back to success, or slide further into obscurity. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah. The investors are getting restless. You need to move faster. Jake rubbed his eyes, exhaustion settling in his bones. He had been running on adrenaline for days, and it was starting to take its toll. But there was no turning back now. He typed a quick response, I'm on it. The startup was making waves in the industry, but Jake knew there was no easy way out. As he clicked through the latest reports and proposals, his mind raced. Everything was fragile. If he made a misstep, it wouldn't just cost him the deal, it would cost him everything. The new project was high stakes. It was the type of venture that could either propel him back into the limelight or bury him completely. The investors had already committed a significant amount of money, but they were demanding results, and they were growing impatient. Jake couldn't afford to wait for everything to fall perfectly into place. If he didn't act quickly, someone else would swoop in, and this chance would slip through his fingers. The next morning, Jake met Sarah at the same cafe. The air between them felt heavier this time. She looked at him with a mixture of concern and determination, as if she could sense the pressure he was under. She didn't waste any time with pleasantries. "You're running out of time, Jake," she said bluntly. "The investors want results, and they want them now." "I know," Jake replied, his voice strained. "But I'm not sure how much longer I can keep this going. The pressure's too much. The board's breathing down my neck, and the startup, it's not going as smoothly as we hoped." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes focused. "This is what you signed up for. There's no going back. You need to make them believe in you again." Jake nodded, a flicker of uncertainty flashing across his face. "How do I do that? They won't listen unless I deliver. And fast." "I've been talking to a few key people who can help," Sarah said, her voice low and deliberate. "You need to pull a rabbit out of the hat. I've got a contact who's willing to help with the technology side of things. They've got the expertise to make this startup blow up, fast. But they're not going to jump on board unless they see you take control of this situation." "Who is it?" Jake asked, his curiosity piqued. "A former colleague. Someone who knows how to turn a project like this into something extraordinary. But they won't do it for free. You'll have to give them something in return. It's not just about getting their help, it's about building trust. You'll need to prove that you can lead this thing, that you're still in the game." Jake hesitated. His mind was racing. This was his chance, but there was so much at stake. He had nothing left to lose, but the thought of getting tangled up in more deals, more people, and more promises made him nervous. "Okay," he said finally, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside. "I'll do it. But if this goes south, it's over. We won't have a second shot." Sarah smiled, the edge of her confidence shining through. "I know. But it won't go south. Not if you make the right moves. You've got everything you need to make this work. You just need to push through." Jake nodded, knowing she was right. If he didn't take this opportunity, there was nothing left for him. It was now or never. Over the next few days, Jake threw himself into the project with a renewed sense of urgency. He worked late into the night, calling investors, meeting with developers, and gathering every bit of information he could. It felt like he was running a marathon at full speed, but he couldn't afford to stop and catch his breath. On the surface, everything seemed to be moving in the right direction. The startup was growing faster than he had expected, and the technology side of things was beginning to come together. But behind the scenes, the investors were becoming more demanding. They wanted results. They wanted to see proof that this was worth their money. Jake had no choice but to deliver, and fast. He started pushing the team harder, making decisions quicker, and taking more risks than he ever had before. The tension in the air was palpable, one wrong move, and it could all come crashing down. Then, one morning, Jake got a call that changed everything. It was a senior member of the board, someone who had once been a close ally. The tone of their voice was cold, and the message was clear: the company was ready to pull the plug on the project if Jake couldn't deliver by the end of the week. Jake's heart sank. He couldn't afford to lose this deal. Not now. Not after everything he had been through. He looked at the clock. It was 3 p.m. The deadline was fast approaching, and he was still waiting on key components of the project. It felt like the weight of the world was bearing down on him, and he was teetering on the edge of failure. But then, Sarah's words echoed in his mind, "You need to make them believe in you again." He closed his laptop and stood up, his hands shaking. This was it. He was going to push forward, no more waiting. He would take the risk, make the call, and get everything he needed to make the project a success. He wasn't going to let this slip through his fingers. Later that evening, Jake sat with Sarah at the cafe again. The plan was in motion, but the tension was palpable. This was no longer just about a business deal, it was about proving that he wasn't done yet. That he still had what it took to succeed. "You've got everything you need, Jake," Sarah said quietly. "Now it's time to execute. No more hesitation." Jake nodded, the weight of his decision settling in. He was on the edge, but this time, he wasn't looking down. He was reaching for the top. "Let's do this," Jake said, a fierce determination in his eyes. As Sarah gave him an approving smile, Jake knew that the next few days would be the hardest of his life. But he was ready. He had nothing left to lose, and everything to gain. Jake's nerves were stretched to their breaking point as he walked into the boardroom the next morning. The room was cold, sterile, with the long polished table gleaming under the bright fluorescent lights. The investors were already seated, their faces expressionless, expectant. Jake could feel the weight of their eyes on him as he took his place at the head of the table, his palms sweaty despite the business suit he wore. This was the moment. The one he had been preparing for, hoping for, even as he struggled in the days before. The project was on the line, and everything he had worked for in the past few weeks rested on this one pitch. "Let's get this over with," Jake muttered under his breath, leaning forward to turn on the projector. As the first slide flickered to life on the screen behind him, Jake steadied his breath. It was a delicate balance of confidence and humility, a fine line between selling the idea and appearing desperate. He couldn't afford to do the latter, not in front of this room of cold, calculating investors who had already given him one chance, and who were now ready to pull out if he failed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jake began, his voice steady, though there was a tightening in his chest, "I'm not here to talk about what's already been done. I'm here to talk about what's about to happen. What we're going to build together. We're on the brink of something big, and the pieces are already falling into place." He clicked to the next slide, showcasing the startup's progress in terms of technology, partnerships, and team structure. His words were methodical, outlining the market potential, the target demographic, and the technological advantages they had developed over their competitors. Jake could see the investors' eyes flicking back and forth between the presentation and him. Some looked impressed, while others seemed skeptical. "We're not just creating a product," he continued, his confidence growing as he spoke, "we're building the future. A future where our technology drives the next wave of innovation in this industry." He could see a few of the investors begin to nod. That was good. He was gaining some ground. But it wasn't enough yet. They still had their doubts. And he knew that if he didn't push for more, he wouldn't be able to close the deal. Not yet. "Now," Jake said, pausing for effect, "I know you've all been concerned about our timeline. But I'm here to tell you that we're not just meeting expectations, we're exceeding them. I've brought in a team of experts who have worked on similar projects in the past. They're already on board, and we're moving faster than ever. We've got everything we need to make this work." As he spoke, Jake could feel the old nervous energy starting to fade. This wasn't just a pitch anymore. It was his moment to prove that he had what it took. Not only to himself but to everyone in the room. He was ready. He had been in the trenches, and now he was standing here, armed with knowledge, confidence, and the truth of his own ambition. The tension in the room was palpable as he clicked to the final slide. It was bold, a risk, and Jake knew it. But it was his last play. He was either going to pull it off or fall. "This is our next move," he said, his voice firm. We're launching a new product, and we're doing it ahead of schedule. It's a game changer, and it's going to give us a massive advantage over our competitors. We're ahead of the curve, and we're going to capitalize on that. The room was silent for a moment, and Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He knew that this was the point of no return. Finally, one of the investors, Harris, the head of the group, leaned forward, his fingers steepled together in a show of thoughtfulness. "Jake, this is all very promising. But I'm still not convinced. You're pushing a lot of ambitious claims here. What guarantees can you offer that this product will launch successfully and that we'll see a return on our investment?" Jake's throat went dry, but he was prepared for this. He had expected the skepticism. "The guarantee," he said calmly, "is in the groundwork we've laid. The partnerships we've secured. And the fact that we've already made substantial progress in testing the prototype. But most importantly, the guarantee is in our team. We've brought together the best minds in the industry. They believe in this, and I believe in them." Harris studied him for a moment, his sharp eyes calculating, before leaning back in his chair and glancing at the other investors. There was a flicker of something behind his gaze. Was it doubt? Interest? Jake couldn't tell. "I'm going to need more than just words, Jake," Harris said. "I need tangible proof. Something I can take back to my stakeholders." Jake nodded, his mind racing. "I understand. That's why I've arranged for a demo in the next 48 hours. We'll have a live demonstration of the product. You'll see for yourself what we've accomplished." The room fell quiet again as the investors exchanged glances. Jake could feel the weight of their expectations, but he held his ground. He wasn't going to back down now. Harris finally broke the silence. "I'll take your word for it. But this needs to be something extraordinary. We've already committed a lot of resources to this, and we won't throw good money after bad." Jake held his breath, waiting for the final verdict. Then, Harris stood up, his expression unreadable. "You have 48 hours, Jake. Make sure this demo delivers. Or we walk." Jake nodded. "I won't let you down." As he walked out of the boardroom, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins, Jake's mind raced. The clock was ticking. He had 48 hours to prove himself, or risk losing everything. There was no room for failure. Later that evening, Jake met with Sarah again, this time in a private conference room at a local hotel. He had barely slept in the past 24 hours, but now, with the pressure mounting, he was more focused than ever. "I did it," Jake said as soon as he walked into the room. "They're on board. But they want a live demo in 48 hours. This is make or break." Sarah's eyes sparkled with recognition of the stakes. "Good. You're playing the game now, Jake. You're in the right position. Now you just need to deliver. Do you have everything you need?" Jake nodded. "I've got the team in place. We've been working on the demo for days. We'll be ready." "Good," she said with a smile. "Then let's make sure it's unforgettable." The next 2 days were a whirlwind of activity. Jake barely had time to eat, let alone sleep. The team was working around the clock, tweaking the prototype, perfecting the presentation, and ensuring that everything was set for the demo. The pressure was unrelenting, but Jake had never felt more alive. This was what he had been waiting for, this was his shot at redemption. As the day of the demo approached, Jake felt a surge of determination. He wasn't going to fail. Not again. Not now. The day of the demo had arrived. Jake could feel the pressure mounting with every passing minute as he sat in the conference room, staring at the sleek prototype on the table. It was quiet, almost too quiet. The hum of nervous energy in the air was palpable, the weight of anticipation hanging heavy on everyone in the room. It had been a grueling 48 hours. The team had barely slept, pushing themselves to the limit to perfect every detail. But now, with the investors just minutes away from entering the room, Jake couldn't help but wonder if it would be enough. The prototype had to perform flawlessly. The investors needed to see a product that not only worked but impressed them beyond measure. Failure wasn't an option. Jake checked his watch again. 9:45 a.m. The investors would arrive in 15 minutes. His hands were trembling as he adjusted his tie, the knot tighter than usual. Every detail had been arranged. The demo would go as smoothly as possible. But deep down, Jake knew that one mistake, one unexpected malfunction, could ruin everything. Everything set up. Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts as she walked into the room, her eyes scanning the space. "Yeah," Jake replied, forcing a smile. "We're ready." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You don't look ready. You look like you're about to face a firing squad." Jake exhaled sharply. "Feels like it. I know. But you've come this far. You can't let doubt creep in now." Jake nodded. "I know. I just can't shake the feeling that we're on the edge of something huge. But it could all slip away in an instant. That's the nature of this business, Jake. High stakes, big rewards. But it's all about the next step. Take control of it. You've got this." Jake appreciated Sarah's words, but he could still feel the nervous energy bubbling beneath the surface. There was no more room for mistakes. The investors would judge him, not just on the product, but on his ability to deliver under pressure. The door to the conference room opened, and the investors filed in, their faces impassive as they took their seats. Harris, the head of the board, was the first to step forward, followed by the other key figures. Jake swallowed hard as he met their gazes. This was it. "Mr. Callahan," Harris said, giving him a small, but calculating smile. "I trust you're prepared. We're looking forward to seeing what you've been working on." Jake stood and nodded. "Absolutely. Thank you for coming today. What we're about to show you is the next step in the future of this industry. We're confident that this product will meet your expectations and exceed them." He gestured toward the table, where the prototype sat under a black cloth. "Allow me to present the demo." Jake pulled the cloth off, revealing the device beneath. It was sleek, futuristic, and pulsing with a subtle energy. There were gasps of approval from a few of the investors. Jake watched their faces carefully, reading their reactions. Some were skeptical, but others seemed intrigued. This was what he needed: intrigue, curiosity, engagement. He pressed a button on the device, and immediately, the screen came to life. Data flashed across the display, charts and graphs illustrating the product's capabilities in real time. The technology behind it was as advanced as anything out there, maybe even ahead of its time. The interface is designed to be intuitive, scalable, and easy to integrate with existing infrastructure, Jake explained. Our team has worked tirelessly to ensure that the product is not only functional but capable of adapting to the needs of diverse industries. As Jake spoke, he could feel the tension in the room ease slightly. The investors were watching closely now, their attention fixed on the device as it demonstrated its capabilities. The data was impressive, but what mattered most was how well it performed in real-world conditions. "We've already run tests with several partner companies," Jake continued. "The feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. They're eager to start integrating this into their systems." The demo progressed smoothly, with the product responding to every command, every interaction, as if it were flawless. For the first time in days, Jake felt a sense of calm wash over him. This wasn't just a presentation, it was a statement. He was proving himself, not just as a businessman, but as a leader. But just as he began to relax, there was a sudden glitch. The screen froze for a split second. Jake's heart skipped a beat, and his stomach lurched. He glanced at the investors, but they didn't seem to notice, too focused on the device. "Give me a second," Jake said quickly, trying to maintain control as he tapped a few keys on the laptop. Sweat started to bead on his forehead as he worked furiously to resolve the issue. This couldn't be happening. Sarah stepped up beside him, her hand hovering over his shoulder. It's just a small hiccup, Jake. We've got this. Jake nodded, fighting to keep his composure. Just a second. It's nothing serious. He worked quickly, bypassing the issue with a few quick commands. The device came back online, and the display resumed functioning as expected. There was a collective sigh of relief from the room, but Jake knew that the investors had seen the glitch. They'd seen the moment of doubt. He had to recover. With a deep breath, Jake resumed the presentation, pushing forward with confidence. He didn't let the glitch become a distraction. Instead, he used it as an opportunity to emphasize the device's ability to adapt and solve problems on the fly. This is why we've focused so heavily on user adaptability, Jake said, his voice steady despite the storm in his chest. Even when things go wrong, the system is designed to fix itself in real time. It's built for high-stress, high-need environments. The investors seemed to buy it. Slowly but surely, their skepticism began to fade. Harris raised an eyebrow, nodding as he took in the functionality of the product. It's impressive, he said, breaking the silence. I'll admit, I wasn't sure what to expect, but I'm starting to see the potential here. Jake exhaled, feeling a wave of relief. This was far from over, but it was a step in the right direction. He wasn't out of the woods yet. There were still questions to answer, details to finalize, and more demos to prove. But at that moment, for the first time in a long while, Jake felt a flicker of hope. As the meeting wound down and the investors began to file out of the room, Harris stayed behind for a moment. He walked over to Jake, his expression neutral but his eyes searching. "You've got my attention, Mr. Callahan," Harris said, his tone clipped but approving. "But we're not finished yet. We'll need to see more before we make any final commitments." Jake nodded, swallowing hard. "I understand. We'll keep pushing." Harris gave a curt nod and turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Just remember, actions speak louder than words." The door clicked shut behind him, and Jake sank back into his chair, exhaustion flooding through him. The demo had been a success, mostly. But there was still so much more to prove. As he turned to Sarah, her eyes were filled with pride, though she said nothing. Jake didn't need words. He knew what this meant. This was his chance. The road ahead was still long, but the finish line was closer than ever. The hours after the demo passed in a blur. Jake barely noticed the hum of the busy office as he sat at his desk, hands clenched around his coffee cup. His mind raced. The demo had gone better than expected, but there was still one massive hurdle left, the final decision. He had gained the investors' interest, but he hadn't secured their commitment. Not yet. Every moment felt like an eternity. His phone lay silent on the desk, the notifications buzzing endlessly on the screen, but Jake didn't care. The only notification that mattered was the one from Harris, the head investor, confirming they were in. Without that, it didn't matter how well the demo had gone. He could already feel the weight of his failures pressing in on him, even with the sliver of hope that remained. It was late afternoon when Jake received the email notification from Harris. He opened the email with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Subject: Follow-up on product demo. Jake. Thank you for the demonstration earlier today. I appreciate the effort and the vision behind your project. However, as we discussed, we are still evaluating the next steps. We'll need a more thorough review of your finances and projections before we make any further commitments. We will be in touch. Best regards. Harris. Jake stared at the email for several long moments, his heart sinking with every passing second. It wasn't a rejection, but it wasn't a confirmation either. The words were polite, but the implication was clear: he hadn't convinced them. Not yet. He leaned back in his chair, frustration rising in his chest. He had given everything. He had worked night and day to get to this point, to make this dream a reality. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. He glanced over at Sarah, who had been pacing the office floor ever since the demo ended. She had been waiting for his reaction, watching him with a sense of curiosity but also understanding. Sarah knew the stakes. She had seen how hard Jake had fought to get to this moment. Jake closed the laptop, frustration bubbling to the surface. It's not enough, Sarah. They're still not convinced. They need more data, more projections, and even more proof of success. Sarah walked over, her face softening with concern. Jake, they're just trying to cover their bases. They don't want to make a mistake, and they need reassurance. But you've done more than enough to show them the potential. Now it's time to show them the results. Jake looked up, meeting her gaze. How do I do that? I've given them everything I've got. She took a deep breath, considering her words carefully. You know what they say. The last step is always the hardest. But you've come so far. Don't give up now. We just need to give them the final push. Jake stared at the ceiling, trying to find the right words, the right strategy. His mind swirled with doubts. What could he show them now that they hadn't already seen? What did they want? Then it hit him, he had a wild card. He could offer them something more than projections, something more than words. The partners he had been working with, the ones who had tested the prototype and seen its value firsthand, had been hesitant to sign the final contracts. But what if he could arrange for them to speak directly to the investors? What if the investors could hear from the people already using the technology, people who could speak with authority about its potential? Jake stood up suddenly, the idea sparking an energy he hadn't felt in days. Sarah, I think I know what we need to do. The next morning, Jake was already on the phone with his contacts, partners who had been quietly watching the development of the product. He needed them now more than ever. As he spoke, explaining the situation and how crucial this was, they seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. One by one, they agreed to join a final meeting with the investors. By the time the clock struck noon, Jake and Sarah were standing at the front of the conference room, ready for what would be the most important meeting of their lives. The investors walked in with their usual air of confidence, but Jake could see that they were still on the fence. Harris was present, but this time, there was an additional wrinkle: 3 of Jake's partner representatives were joining the meeting as well. They were ready to speak for themselves, to vouch for the product and its capabilities. Jake took a deep breath. The stakes had never been higher. I'm glad we could all meet again, Jake began, standing before the room. Before we dive into anything further, I'd like to introduce a few key people who have been using our technology firsthand. These individuals can speak to the value this product is already providing, and why it's not just the future, it's the present. He turned to his partners, who were sitting on the side, their faces a picture of confidence. One by one, they stood up and spoke about the product's impact on their businesses, how it had streamlined operations, increased efficiency, and driven results in ways that no competitor had been able to match. The data speaks for itself, said one of the partners, a CEO of a logistics company. Since we integrated this technology, our efficiency has improved by 20%. We've seen a noticeable reduction in operating costs and an increase in client satisfaction. This isn't just a prototype. It's a solution that works today. Jake watched as Harris listened intently, nodding along with what the partner was saying. For the first time, Jake saw a flicker of genuine interest in Harris's eyes. The other partners shared similar testimonials, speaking from experience and offering tangible proof of the product's capabilities. By the time they finished, Jake could see the shift in the room. The skepticism had started to wane. The investors were no longer just analyzing numbers and projections, they were hearing from people who had used the product and witnessed its effectiveness. Harris was the first to break the silence. I have to admit, Jake, he said, his tone softer than before, you've convinced me. This product has potential. But I need one last thing from you. I need you to put your money where your mouth is. Jake nodded, his heart racing. He had anticipated this. He knew what it meant. What's your offer? Jake asked. We'll invest, Harris said, but we need your commitment. Full transparency. Financials. Projections. And we need you to show us that you can scale this quickly. The market's moving fast. If we're in, we're all in. But we need to know that you're ready to make this leap. Jake stood still for a moment, his mind racing. But then, he smiled. You've got it. Full transparency. And we'll scale quickly, together. As the meeting came to a close, Jake felt the weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't a done deal yet, but it was as close as it had ever been. The investors had given their commitment. The partners were on board. And for the first time in a long time, Jake allowed himself to believe in what he had built. Congratulations, Sarah said, clapping him on the back as they left the room. You did it. Jake smiled, but he knew the battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. There was a long road ahead, but for the first time, he felt like he was truly on the right path. The morning sun filtered through the large windows of the office, casting soft shadows across the conference table. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, yet Jake couldn't shake the feeling of the weight still pressing on his chest. This was the final step, the culmination of everything he had worked for. After months of sleepless nights, countless presentations, and endless revisions, today was the day he would either succeed or fail. The contract had arrived a few hours ago, a thick, official document. His hand still shook as he ran through the terms, each line a testament to how close he was to securing the future of the company. The deal was real. The money was real. The investors were on board. But there was one last task, signing the contract and officially sealing the deal. Jake, you all right? Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. She stood by the door, her eyes full of concern. You look like you're about to faint. Jake chuckled weakly, leaning back in his chair. I'm fine. Just, trying to process everything. It feels unreal. Sarah crossed the room, sitting down beside him. I get it. It's a lot. But you've earned this. Don't let doubt creep in now. You've been ready for this moment for months. He nodded slowly, but deep down, something still gnawed at him. This wasn't just about the deal. It was about the future. What would come after? How would he navigate the next steps? The product was secure, the investors were in, but there were still so many uncertainties ahead. Could he really lead this company to the heights he'd dreamed of? Could he deliver on everything he had promised? The door to the office opened, and Harris walked in, a stern look on his face. Jake stood up immediately, shaking Harris's hand firmly. Well, Mr. Callahan, Harris said, his voice cool but with a hint of respect. It's time. Let's make this official. Jake's heart raced as he watched Harris set the contract on the table. He could feel his pulse quicken as he reached for the pen. This was it. The moment everything would change. He took a deep breath and signed the paper, feeling the weight of the decision settle in. The investors had given Jake everything he needed, capital, resources, and support. In return, Jake had promised to push forward, to grow the company at an unprecedented rate. And now, it was all down to him. No more waiting. No more doubting. It was time to execute. As he signed, Sarah smiled warmly at him. You did it, Jake. You've made it. Jake sat back down in his chair, the weight of the pen still in his hand. It felt surreal. It felt like a dream. But it wasn't a dream, it was reality. The business was his. The responsibility was his. And now, it was time to prove he could handle it. Later that day, Jake found himself standing in the middle of a buzzing office, surrounded by his team. The company had been through a lot in the past few months, but they had made it through. The tension, the doubts, the struggles, it was all behind them now. They had secured the investment. The future was now in their hands. "I can't believe it," Jake said aloud, looking around at the faces of his team. They were all gathered together, eager to hear the news. "We did it. We've got the backing we need to make this happen." The room erupted in applause. Sarah stepped forward, her smile wide. "I knew you had it in you, Jake. This is just the beginning." Jake nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He had spent so long thinking about this moment, but now that it was here, he couldn't quite find the words. He had made it through the darkest times, the moments when failure seemed inevitable, and now he was standing at the edge of something bigger than he had ever imagined. "Okay, let's not waste any more time," Jake said, clapping his hands together to regain focus. "We've got work to do. The road ahead is long, but we've got what it takes to get there. We're not just building a product anymore, we're building a company. A company that can change the world." The team nodded in agreement, their eyes filled with excitement. They weren't just employees anymore, they were partners in this journey. They believed in the vision, and now they had the resources to make it happen. Jake walked to the front of the room, standing before the whiteboard where he had once mapped out his dreams. The vision had changed over time, evolved with the company's growth, but the core of it had always remained the same: innovation, progress, and success. "We've got the investors' backing," Jake continued. "Now it's time to focus on the next stage. Scaling. Execution. We need to hit the ground running and make sure we're ready for the next phase of growth." Sarah raised her hand, her voice enthusiastic. "What about the launch? We're ready to roll out the first batch to our partners." Jake smiled. "Absolutely. Let's make it happen. But we need to do it right. We've worked too hard to get here. I don't want to rush. We'll launch when we're ready, but not a minute before." The team nodded, understanding the gravity of the moment. This was it. The launch was just the beginning. The real work had only just begun. As the day drew to a close, Jake found himself alone in the office, staring out the window. The city lights flickered below him, a reminder that the world was moving faster than ever. But for the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he was in control. He had done it. He had navigated the storm, and now he was on solid ground. His phone buzzed on the desk, snapping him from his thoughts. He picked it up, glancing at the screen. It was a message from one of the investors. "Jake, congratulations again on securing the deal. We're excited to see where this goes. Let's schedule a call next week to discuss next steps." Jake couldn't help but smile. They were in. They were really in. He put the phone down and took a deep breath. The road ahead would be long and filled with challenges. There would be setbacks, obstacles, and moments of doubt. But Jake was no longer afraid. He had faced the toughest battle and come out on top. He had built something real. It was time to build even more. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?